So it looks like this month so far we have 67 listens from Virginia.
From Virginia, the state of Virginia.
The state of Virginia. Do we know anyone in Virginia?
The only people I think we might know in Virginia are either A, Democrats looking for future candidates to push. Flo.
That's probably what it is.
Or this is what I think it is, actually.
Flo is done. She's leaving the meeting.
Isn't he slinking away?
I think it's. I don't think you're Sac famous. I don't think you're Virginia famous.
I'm not Virginia famous.
Yeah.
I'm barely Sac famous. So
I'd argue that, but
I think it's the feds. I think it's the Pentagon is finally catching on to our antics.
What do you think?
Dun, dun, dun.
What do you think the feds
saying?
listen to the show on? Do you think they're like an Apple podcast group, or are they like a Spotify crew, or what do you think?
I don't know. We only get like 5% listens on our Spotify.
so it's not them.
They strike me as Android
it's all
people.
Yeah.
The government usually isn't like Team Apple.
'cause of, like,
Yeah, they don't like
encrypted
Apple, especially
stuff.
not the surveillance people. They really don't.
So
like
they're Android people. So maybe, a podcast addict or something like that is where
I
we're
think
getting
you're right.
our
Yeah.
downloads.
Yeah.
I'd like to imagine that this is what they listen to on their way into the office, although maybe they're not doing that right now. So maybe this is what they listen to in the morning while they make their coffee and eat breakfast.
That is a
Probably
lot of
breakfast
listeners.
podcast.
Like 67 in Virginia is a lot. Like for like clarification, we get like basically all of our listens are obviously for obvious reasons are in California, but we get like our next two biggest states are like 11 in Nevada and like 14 in Arizona.
Yeah.
So to have
All neighboring states.
to have 67 listens in Virginia is strange.
So is it like downloads or is it listens? Because is it one person who just like is in love with Shannon and listened to our episode 67 times? Or is it like
Is that what it is?
That might be it.
Or is it like someone with like 67 different devices that's like, I'm gonna download the podcast every
Probably,
Maybe.
you know what it probably is? It's probably a guy in Virginia who has 67 Bluetooth speakers that he just wraps in a circle around his living room.
Right.
Yeah.
And he just listens to Shannon's part of the episodes, like in like crazy, like 67 point stereo.
That's it.
Mhm.
And he knows her
for him.
wheelhouse for sure. Like he's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is gonna be a Shannon episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get ready. Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
into it.
Surround sounded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I mean, now that we know the feds are, well,
Flattered.
I think they're listening because, I'm a leftist. Skylar's a leftist. We've all been fighting this sort of Black Lives Matter fight. We know that that's what cops and feds like to do, right? They like to listen to what the social unrest folks are saying, and they want to get to know our mindset and infiltrate and mess up the movement. So I figure for this episode, at the beginning of this one, at the very least, why don't we just maybe we all have something to say to our Fed? All right, it's probably like an intern too.
Yeah. Oh, honey. Well, listen, it's nice that you're starting your career out. I just want to tell you, when you're on an internship, just remember, if you don't like it, there's a lesson in all of it, and just, take the skills you learn here and maybe apply them somewhere else if this isn't a good fit for you.
Yeah, I like that. I would follow up on that and say, if it turns out that this isn't for you, and maybe the culture at the FBI isn't going the way you thought it would, or the tie's a little too tight if you happen to have to wear one to work. You could always follow me to the Death to America route, and I'll take you in with open arms. I'll pay more than they do too, I bet.
Oh, I love it.
I'm pleading the fifth on this one. I don't have anything to say to the damn feds.
But honestly, they know everything they already need to know about us. So.
Yeah. I'm not fucking careful about talking shit next to my iPhone like at any time. So I'm
also, everything they need to know about you is written on your body. So.
They can only they can't see my whole body.
I love that was like a moment where Skylar was like, wait, can I do this joke? Like, I don't think I can do this joke. I don't think I can sleep tonight if I do this joke.
They probably listen because Dave was saying that we throw pocket change at cops in one of the last episodes.
Yeah, that's right.
And then I described it as a shotgun blast, but what I meant was I just throw handfuls of change, not that I like drive by with shotguns.
Right. And
I you know, it's not a huge surprise to me that we have 67 listens from Virginia, I guess.
They did not
now that I think about that episode, it's not that surprising.
They don't need to make a trek to my front door next time. Like, you guys, you need a satire class at CIA. At Army, and maybe, you know, it might save a little time.
I'm just going to like go through and slice up all of the most inflammatory parts of the podcast and just release it myself so that then I won't ever be able to run for office and then everybody can just leave me alone.
Your personal auto research. That is exactly what you're going to do. Right. Yes.
I feel like if you do that, you're just going to end up having a greater following of people pushing for office.
It's true, 100%.
They're like, they want you at the pulpit.
If you do that, you will wind up as the president of the United States of America.
I guess it's not a pulpit in City Council.
Please no, make it stop.
Shannon, did you have anything to add for our federal friends?
Yeah, I hope you fucking love this shit. We're doing it for you.
All right, let's go.
Hell yeah. All right.
What about your one fan with his 67 different Bluetooth? Do you have anything to say to him?
Don't forget to give us $1 squillion and I'll show you my tits.
Damn. Shannon's down for the cause.
We did say that's on the table for this show.
Yeah, that's true.
We will do full frontal. So you just have to give us the right price.
All right.
Which is $1 squillion.
Your move, Uncle Sam. All right, let's get started.
All right, yeah.
Anybody wants full frontal when all of the wax places have been closed? It's not going to be fun.
Voices, the things they said. Voices, some from those dead. All the voices heard. Voices, things we say. Voices, they're in your head. All the voices heard.
Hello, everyone. You have Kempa.
And Skylar.
And Shannon.
And Flo.
Hooray. We've got a good one today. We didn't assign the homework, but we thought we would go over chapters 3 and 2. We're going to go in inverse of The End of Policing by Alex Vital. Again, listeners, you can read along with us. We've already done chapter 1. Verso Books has made the ebook free to download simply because we are living in the current political moment we are as far as policing goes. And it's very important that we start discussing this idea of ending policing. We wanted to start with chapter 3 today because this one discusses the school to prison pipeline. And there are definitely some very local stories going down regarding police in our schools. Who would like to tackle that?
I guess anybody can jump in, but this has been an ongoing issue in Sacramento for a while. The Black Parallel School Board, as well as many, parents throughout the community, have been voicing their concerns for at least 18 months now about what are known as SROs, or school resource officers, occupying a pretty substantial chunk of the budget and being in schools. And we know that they are part of the school, what's known as the School to prison pipeline. So it means that when they are in schools, you are more likely to see an escalation of what normally would be handled internally, the referrals out to juvenile justice and things like that. There's also the escalation that can happen just in terms of the methods that school resource officers use, because while they are supposed to be trained to specifically work with children and work in schools, and they sometimes don't wear a full uniform like a normal beat cop would, they are still trained police officers, and so their default training is how they engage with the community, and so that doesn't often translate well to children who have developing brains, and situations that could require some either de-escalation or in some instances, I don't want to call it turning a blind eye to it, but sort of like not responding to those situations, and instead they end up being escalated. So things like having drugs on campus or things like carrying a weapon on campus can come with a hefty fine, or even juvenile justice involvement, where they might have been handled differently if it was just a school administrator handling that situation.
Right.
So what's going on politically in the moment, Shannon?
Yeah.
Sorry, I did. Yeah,
and
go. Yeah, so Sac City Unified in 2019 had voted to reduce the number of resource officers on district campuses, and that or by more than half when that contract was renewed with the SPD, Sacramento Police Department. And it should be noted that board members Leticia, Garcia, and Vang voted against it.
Vang running for District 8 of City Council, so I think it's noteworthy to notice that she said, I don't want any cops.
Yeah, note where she lands.
Yeah, I think like just for people who might be new to the show, like put Vang in your brain right now, because that is a race you're going to want to pay attention to.
So this contract ends June 30th. Mm-hmm. And so that's like, what if it, I mean, I don't know what time is anymore, so I'm not really sure what day it is, but I know that June 30th is coming up.
Next
little
Tuesday.
Over a week. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. A week from when you hear this podcast.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of just like politically, in terms of our local politics around school resource officers being on campuses.
And it's noteworthy that they were one vote away from ending the contracts in the past. And that one, well, I mean, it could be any of the people on there, but one of the votes that I know people were really disappointed in was Jessie Ryan's vote, because she expressed some sympathy towards the cause or some empathy, but she ultimately decided to continue the contracts the last time this question came up. And so there's been a lot more progress and momentum this time. Another thing that's, I think, important to understand is that at the time, Sac City Unified claimed that they didn't have any money and were $30 million or something in the hole.
Right.
And then suddenly they found that money under their mattress. So it's a really strange...
Weird. After they tried to break the teacher unions. Funny.
Right. So there's strange politics happening there, and some serious questions about just leadership in general with the Sacramento City Unified School District that I think are noteworthy for this conversation as well. But certainly when we're talking about where we might be able to cut funds when we have some we're facing shortages, this seems like a really, appropriate place to turn our attention.
Well, especially like given the current national circumstance, right? Like, if I'm not mistaken, Minneapolis has decided to pull cops out of their school districts entirely, and so
whole hog, as it were.
They never should have been there in the first place.
This little piggy got kicked out of school.
Like, this shouldn't even be progress. It should just be like, wow, we're righting a historic wrong. They never should have been in our schools in the first place.
There should be no question. They first of all were in a space that they don't belong, and then second of all, you know, the neolibs, once they were in the space, were just trying to say, well, let's try to train them to do other things too, like counseling. And it's like, no, and we'll get to that.
It's not how it goes. It's not how
And
it
these
works.
schools
Get 'em
don't
out.
have school counselors. They don't have mental health supports on
Right.
campus. They don't
Precisely.
have some of the things that would make sense to, if you were going to fund, for those who are still sympathetic to the police state cause, like if you were going to fund police, you would probably want to do that after you funded a series of other things, after you've made it so kids are not, you know, collecting debt for school lunches. Like, I can think of a lot of places where I would spend my money before I would get to the place where there would be police in schools, in part because I don't believe in having police in schools or other places. But just in general, like this is just like it should be a non-starter
It's a
for a conversation.
no-brainer.
Yes.
They're obviously a counselor and mental health professionals, and you know, people who care about the students' well-being as opposed to enforcing the law.
Right.
It should be
On people with developing brains.
Yeah,
Right.
That can't be understated.
And some
I think
people
you're right,
who
yes.
have developmental challenges, like
Right.
there was in that B article that Shannon was talking about, they have a list of stats about like who per 10,000 students actually gets hit with like recommendation for legal whatever, or people who actually are like arrested
Straight
at
up
school
arrested, right?
and put in jail. And it should surprise no one that the most outsized graphic of that is black children. The second most is developmentally challenged children. So,
of course.
And
like,
Native American children too.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be two of those three,
Right.
you're getting kicked out of school jackpot.
Yeah.
Tell them what you want, Skylar. Like, I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, that stat, I mean, obviously all of it is incredible, but just in like, you know, as someone who I feel like I've read enough about this kind of thing to like where I feel like things don't shock me anymore. When you hear about like developmentally challenged kids like having a fucking mental crisis and then being like beaten down and arrested by police officers in their fucking school,
Right.
for fuck's sake.
It's something
and
that
let's also consider the kids who maybe don't have a diagnosis because they're concerned about labeling, but who have some challenges, right? So like, just because a student doesn't have an official IEP doesn't mean they're not dealing with trauma, does not mean they're not dealing with something that hasn't yet been identified.
Right. Acronym alert, IEP.
Right. Oh, sorry. It's an individualized education plan.
Thank you. Meaning?
It means basically that usually if you are someone who has some special needs in terms of your education plan, there's a plan that's put together for how those needs are going to be met, whether that's done within the classroom or whether it's done outside.
Okay, cool. Did I interrupt your thought, Flo?
No, I don't think so.
Can we start up on the history of these SROs? SRO is always weird for me to say because I come from
single room occupancy.
Yeah.
Right.
We were talking about no SROs and somebody was like,
whoa.
Tell me more about your politics.
I like
I'm
SROs. Yeah, I want people to have housing.
So we're pro SRO for housing and we're anti SRO for education. Just in case anyone's there. And that's single room occupancy for housing and school resource officers for education.
Yes. Well, let's go down to the history of it. I think what we read in the book that the SROs in schools sort of started as almost a little bit of a propaganda / community policing effort in the 1950s in Flint, Michigan.
Yep.
So, you know, cops wanted to sort of improve their relationship with the community. Flint, obviously, like...
by arresting children.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, that is the best practice.
It's a great way to get people to want to join your profession.
Right. And then from there, they started popping up in different schools around the U.S., I think through the 60s with the same sort of thrust, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in time, we got into this era where we started defunding our entire social safety net, you know, mental health social services, low-income housing, all of those things, and really feeding more and more, if not into just not taxing our corporate, overlords, also just feeding more and more of those tax dollars into punitive enforcement of laws, our police forces. And it started to grow and grow all the way up into the 70s and 80s, when the Republicans were getting tough on crime, right? This was their sort of racist dog whistle. And throughout that time, they managed to amp up the number of officers in schools, saying that, there are kids that it was this one guy in particular who worked with one of the authors of the whole concept behind broken windows policing. And they were saying, there are some kids that are going to come out of these schools that are just, you're not going to be able to reach them. They're going to be these like predators, and you're going to have to, lock them up. And like, are you ready, America? Are you ready for that? And
it was a super predator conversation, right? I mean, they were having that. That was a big, that was a fun bipartisan discussion that was happening, where the super predator, unreachable criminals. This was the first I'd read of them being children who are in school.
Right.
Because as I recall, they were just like, crackheads or whatever who were unrehabilitatable or whatever, as described by Republicans and Democrat politicians alike, in order to throw a ton of money at law enforcement.
Well, the history of political strategy there is the Republicans slammed the gas on that in the 70s and 80s. And in 88, when Dukakis, who was the Democratic nominee, lost to George Bush Sr., Bush the Elder, he was basically called out as the weak on crime candidate. And so Bush won. Democrats were like, oh shit, that's just a loser for us. And so, Bill Clinton comes around in 92 and says, no, you know what? I'm the tough on crime candidate.
Right. Who can be the toughest on crime is now the game that we're playing, right?
Yeah. And it turned it into this basically bipartisan racism that like, it was just the race to the bottom, which has yielded the space we're in today. Go, Flo.
And it's important to note that, while I think, millennials and Gen Z, is it that's coming after us?
Mm-hmm. The Zoomers.
Okay. The Zoomers. Okay. While we look back on that and we're like, what the fuck, everybody else who was of voting age at the time, that was seen as a bipartisan issue, that was seen as the Black community is asking for this. The Latino community is asking for this. Like, everybody was supercharged around this idea of getting tough on crime and cracking down on what was happening in communities, because this was a good idea. And so it's always important, like, even if we recognize something is wrong, to just recognize what was happening at the time, because now people are looking back on that and saying this was super racist, which it totally was. But at the time, you had people of color, Black and Indigenous people of color, saying this is what we want and championing these very policies that we see now in retrospect were just terrible.
Yeah, we had a very depressed capital L left at that time. I don't think your Jesse Jacksons were really getting much play, or your Cornell Wests were being listened to as much in those days. It was really again, yeah, like all of the whole spectrum of politics was this very, very small little space. Go Sky.
I have a question, a legitimate question. When in this era, when exactly does the war on drugs really take off? Like, when is that sold and like put into operation?
Well, Nixon started it, right?
Yeah, I was gonna
Right.
say Nixon declares the drugs public enemy number one, and that is 1971. It goes back and forth. I mean, the war on drugs technically begins with Harry Anslinger in 1930 when he was like hell bent on this idea that like marijuana was this drug that made
Reefer
Negroes
madness.
and Filipinos
Yeah.
and Hispanics and jazz entertainers,
Right, those jazz musicians
want to have, think they're as good as white men and want to have sex with white women, and it was a whole thing, right?
He makes it sound so cool to smoke weed.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And so he passed all this legislation that could give you up to 80 years, the Boggs Act, just for simple possession of marijuana. And so you go back and forth because by 44, the New York Academy of Medicine is like, what are you guys talking about? Marijuana doesn't do any of the things that you all are claiming.
Right.
And so they do this political football thing back and forth. Who's in office? Schaefer Commission comes out right after Nixon and says, we should decriminalize this stuff. They're like, no, we're going to double down on it. So it goes back and forth. But it really ramps up, especially in the 80s with Reagan and with when he passes the Crime Act and stuff like that in 86 and 88. And all of that has to do with, kind of doubling down on the penalties as well. And that was in response to the crack era, right? So all of that is happening. So now we're in the 90s and the entire communities have been destroyed by crack cocaine. And so they are
But it's specific communities who are being targeted by this, right?
Absolutely.
Because what the war on drugs actually accomplishes is it gives law enforcement a way to enforce laws in some communities and not enforce them in others. Right. And by talking up super predators and how bad crack cocaine is, they're able to criminalize some folks while not criminalizing other folks. I mean, the 80s are famous for being like a complete cocaine orgy for like wealthy white people.
Right.
So,
right. Well, that was the sort of crack cocaine, argument in terms of how much it costs, right? And so cocaine is the high-end drug. And that feeling lasts even through the early aughts, because if you remember Whitney Houston's very famous, like, I would never do crack. Crack is too cheap, right? Like, she was like, I'm a cocaine girl. How dare you, right? Like, so there's still that stigma associated with crack versus cocaine that lingers. But we also have to remember that, like, the 80s and 90s are very much a respectability thing, right? Like there's still this middle road that we don't get into partisan politics, and the left doesn't really take off as being a really progressive left. The left was like, hey, I don't use like racial epithets in public, and I go to college and I live in middle class suburbia, and that's like my thing, right? Like that's as far left, like Dave was mentioning, as we were like, as was mainstream and was getting coverage. And so I do think we have to thank the internet. We have to thank,
Thank you,
people
Al.
coming along afterwards and like kind of pushing things, because we didn't have a left that was saying anything other than you all should pull up your pants and go to college. And that was coming from everybody at the time. Like respectability politics were real. Affirmative action was the big black issue that people wanted to champion behind. And nobody was saying, why are so many people heading to jail and prison right now? Like that was not a bad thing at the time.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we know this in every respect. A radical left on racial issues, the Black Panthers were like sent to prison, right? On worker issues, our labor was just deeply depressed, and the government actually depressed our economy in the 70s to crush labor. And we were in a space that was just this sort of desolate, conservative to neolib desert, effectively. So where does that start to bring us toward today, from the 90s to now?
Yeah, I mean, the school officers conversation, obviously,
Yes,
you can't go in that direction without mentioning Columbine, right? Because now they get what to them must have been like Christmas, unfortunately, which is like these school shootings that start happening that are high profile. The first of which that happened in this way in terms of high school or below was Columbine, and so now
worst of these things. Sorry to interrupt, but the first of these things that happened in like a wealthy suburban white neighborhood,
right?
Because there's already been plenty of violence at high schools in other communities, but we don't have to care about that. But now it has happened at Columbine. All of a sudden, now we care. Right.
Yeah, and I think there is a distinction between the sort of mass school shootings and like drive-bys or specific things happening between individual people. Like Columbine was the first time that we saw tons of people being killed in school who really didn't have any, like there wasn't any like pre-existing
beef
there wasn't
it
wasn't like hey, this is a gang thing, hey, this is like an individual beef thing. This was just like I showed up and indiscriminately slaughtered my classmates and schoolmates. So, and that became the conversation, right? And so as more of that continue to happen, it builds up the political capital for policing and for having officers in the schools to be able to respond to these issues, right? And so really doubling down on that.
The other thing that like really like stuck with me was the link between having SROs in schools and the rise of standardized testing being like kind of the primary way that we like measure success in the education system, which kind of has like kind of a long history, but eventually it kind of gets into all schools and it puts teachers and educators into a position where their funding relies on how well their kids do on these standardized tests, right? So if you want your funding, if you want a bonus, your kids had better hit this average of this thing, right? So what that does is it incentivizes the educators to get rid of the kids who are pulling the average down. It doesn't, it's much easier just to remove them from the pile than it is to like lift them up to where they need to be. And so as soon as these things come in, you see suspension skyrocket, you see expulsion skyrocket, you see kids getting thrown out of school for all kinds of infractions, because not only do they want to kick these kids out of school for that, but if they're worried that like, dude, these guys are distracting the good students who are like pumping my numbers up and getting me where I need to be. And of course, if you like follow that through to its natural conclusion, bringing in cops to like arrest kids is the best version of that, because then the educators don't even have to worry about it. They're like, oh, cool, like the cops are here to handle that for me. Like, hey, this guy is being a dickhead in class, and now he like gets penalized legally, right? Like that's even better. He's not coming back from that. And so that tie between standardized testing and increased punitive punishments against the students is really insidious, and I had never really put that together before.
This was a thing that in my high school experience, I grew up in North Long Beach, which is in Southern California, inner city. It's what you think of when you say an inner city high school experience. And
I'm thinking about Michelle Pfeiffer when you say that.
Yeah, that's what I get from a lot of people.
I'm thinking your music teacher was Bradley Noel.
So something that's thinking back on it, like it was also normal at the time. So I never thought about it critically, other than like, why the fuck are these cops on our campus all the time? But something that would come up is during standardized testing week, like our detention rooms were monitored by the SROs, like so that if you acted out, because I wasn't the best high school student. I may have ditched class from time to time to smoke or read a book that I thought was more interesting than the one that we were reading in class. So yeah, maybe I did end up in those detention rooms, but like, it's like when those officers were in there, you get in way more trouble. Like kids would end up hauled out of the detention room in handcuffs, right? Mm-hmm. Like, And that's, we talk about the school to prison pipeline, like all of a sudden you have a potential felony if you've like hit an officer during, like if you've resisted arrest and then hit an officer during this time because you're a Black or brown or indigenous person in like inner city where you're targeted all the time, like, and you're scared, and so of course you fling your arm and you hit an officer and now you have a felony on your record. Like,
yeah. Can I read a little excerpt from the book?
Please.
These SROs meet up every year to discuss, the work that they're doing at these schools. And I think this sets a really good example of the kind of culture they're building. Okay, so the National Association of School Resource Officers has become a bastion of this process, and that's the process of using guns and militarized equipment in school. Its annual convention is a panoply of military contractors trying to sell schools new security systems, train officers in paramilitary techniques, and makes the case that students are at constant risk from themselves and outsiders. Ana Fuentes attended one such convention and was appalled at the keynote speaker, and, quote, anti-terrorism expert, unquote, with no domestic law enforcement or pedagogical training, who warned the hundreds of officers present. Now, this is his straight quote. "You've got people in your schools right now planning a Columbine. Every town, every university now has a Cho." Cho was the Virginia Tech shooter. "And in every state, we have Al-Qaeda cells thinking of it. Every school is a possible target of attack. You've got to be a one-man fighting force. You've got to have enough guns and ammunition and body armor to stay alive. You should be walking around in school every day in complete tactical equipment with semi-automatic weapons and 5 rounds of ammo. You can no longer afford to think of yourselves as peace officers. You must think of yourselves as soldiers at war, because we're going to ask you to act like soldiers."
This is the least offensive part of that, but 5 rounds of ammo?
Yeah.
Of course, Tyler.
Dog, you're gonna need more rounds.
Of course.
What are you doing in a
5 rounds
tactical
is gonna be
outfit with 5 rounds of ammo? If you're wearing a tac vest, you need 500 rounds of ammo at least.
Maybe that's what they meant.
And this is why the FBI is listening. Thanks to everyone out there for just tuning in. Thanks, there, little intern. Appreciate you.
Hey, intern.
Hi, FBI.
No, obviously that's outrageous. It also doesn't make sense why that would be the case. Like, obviously that's not true for starters, right? Like, it's just false on its face that like every school has like a Columbine shooter just waiting in the wings, like whatever. Like, that's clearly not true. For two, why don't they do this shit for people who work in malls or grocery stores or movie theaters or any place ever where a bunch of people congregate? Like, why is it schools that are like so much more likely for this in this guy's mind than like, I don't know, like, yeah, like Safeway? I don't get it.
Yeah. I don't know. It's that I mean, I have the disconnect when we start treating schools like supermax prisons, which shouldn't exist anyway, like,
right.
Let's talk about carcerality in general. Like, it's completely fucked up. But then when we start treating institutions of learning into spaces where kids feel, where developing minds start to let go of learning and instead develop into fearful people, fearful of authority, fearful of being in a fucking classroom because you've got cops everywhere. You don't know what you can or can't say. You don't know what you can or can't do. You don't know what's going to get you like knocked to the floor by a cop or arrested. But I mean, there are stories of, in this book, there's that story of the kid living with a disability who is arrested and handcuffed by his biceps because his wrists are too small for handcuffs. Like, these are not like schools are not a battlefield, you know, and like stop it.
Dude, imagine that being your afternoon. Like you assault a child with a learning disability and handcuff them by the fucking biceps because they're too slight to fit into handcuffs the normal way. Like imagine being a piece of shit on the fucking level that like that's what you do after lunch is you perpetrate that shit on that kind of I just like
it's promoting
my fucking brain
Scott.
boggles. It's like it's shit like that where I'm like, dude, who is defending these fucks?
Yeah, it's and that like the problem with that like disciplinary based perspective of education or implementation of education, right? Like everything is about like that we're in danger of these kids, or let's just the way to get these kids to learn is to discipline them, right? And that students end up like just not going the fuck back to school because why would I? You know, like it's not like this isn't actually a space that is inspiring or where I even feel protected,
Right, or
know,
safe.
Like, totally.
Right.
Oh.
Who would feel safe in those circumstances?
Right.
Yeah. This
chapter was a big like a big realization for me in terms of like the amount of privilege that I had going to school. Because I talked about going to Waldorf school earlier, but it was like the exact opposite of this. Like there wasn't like I was in Fair Oaks. There wasn't a cop within like fucking 100 miles of me the entire time I was in high school, you know, and like reading about some of these accounts was just like, holy shit. Like I knew not everybody had as easy of a time as I did going through high school, but for fuck's sake, it's like, it's a fucking war zone.
Somebody asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yes, I was just going to say that. My mom sent me that tweet earlier.
You know,
it's a good one.
What does a community without police, a world without police look like? And she said, well, it looks like affluent white communities.
Looks like the suburbs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you don't see cops out there.
Right.
You don't think about cops.
And if you do, it's benign because they're not going to fuck with you.
Right.
They're not out there looking for you.
I was like, they're not looking for the people in their own communities. They are they're looking for the people who they think don't belong.
Right.
That was exactly her point, was like, this is how people in a community are policed, is a suburb.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at how much money is spent on other things, you'll see that people double down on education. They double down on, making sure their parks are well staffed and well maintained. They double down on all the things that we, public health, social service folks are always like, this is where we should spend our money. That's how their budgets are spent.
Yeah. We don't have to spend too much time on this, but I sent you all this video clip. Flo, one of our senior fellows from Nehemiah Emerging Leaders Program, was sort of pushing the conversation on the end of policing and what that looks and feels like. And she shared with our group this old like KCRA footage from her high school in 1995. And she's like, this was a seriously traumatizing moment for me, and it changed forever how I viewed police. And in this video, effectively, it's at Encina High in 1995, January 1995. So KCRA did footage on it. The Bee has written stories on it. Apparently, they had one SRO on site most of the time. Mm-hmm. But on this day, they happened to have 4 Sac Sheriff's Department deputies there, I suppose in plain clothes. And they allegedly were there because they thought there was going to be some sort of gang fight that day, some sort of gang activity. And there was a tiny altercation in And it's a small high school of like 200 or so kids in Arden area.
I think it said 800. 200 of them were at lunch at the time that this incident
thank you
happened.
so much for verifying. And they, like, a couple kids bumped shoulders. There was like a little back and forth of arguing. And according to this boy in the B article, he said, the boy, Shamond Bennett, a junior, said the fight started after a girl bumped into him and he demanded an apology. He said the girl, whom officials at the school refused to identify, then asked him to take it outside. A school monitor told Bennett to calm down, and the boy said he did. Then 2 cops came out of nowhere and grabbed me, said Bennett, who was not arrested. I said, "What are you doing?" Then 2 more came out and started spraying in my face. And by spraying, he means pepper spray.
Yeah, or mace.
Yeah. And so it turned into this wild, dramatic scene. And the 3 of you saw this, of basically Sac Sheriff Department deputies spraying kids with pepper spray and tackling them and throwing them down and cuffing them. 9 kids went to the hospital that
They
day.
grab a kid, throw him on the ground, and then just start like MMA ground and pounding this kid.
Punching a kid.
Who's been like maced in the face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is like, these are the exact scenarios that we see during peaceful protest, right? Like, and we can't say it enough, and we do say it often, time and time again, when law enforcement are involved in fucking anything, it's going to create a violent situation, not because the people have caused it, but because the cops have, because they can't
escalate.
they escalate everything.
Every
they can't
goddamn
keep
time.
their shit in check. Like, if dude, if you ask a high school kid, like, can you like not bump into that girl when you walk by her? It's a high school kid who's gonna be like, go fuck yourself. Well, then all of a sudden the cops, like, now you're gonna get pepper sprayed and we're gonna start a whole riot. Like, we, the cops, are gonna start this riot because I'm angry that you didn't respect my bullshit authority.
Right.
What?
Correct.
Right.
I want to send this clip to Jesse Ryan of the school board. What is that? Sac City Unified. I know you sit on the same dais as Flo once a month, Jesse, so we won't get too deep into it, but I very sincerely hope you change your mind on this shit, because we don't need these cops.
We don't need them.
We don't need them in school.
No. And that, dude, and especially like, I mean, just even if they weren't like fucking violent thugs who are like happy to beat up and assault children, if that were not enough of a reason to get rid of them, like they take up so much fucking money, and schools are so underfunded. Like, what the fuck? How could you possibly, like, this guy in the fucking book, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it, but like, they have bought grenade launchers for fucking SROs.
Right.
What the fuck? Like, in a fucking system that is like consistently underfunded, that has like teachers have to buy their own fucking like pencils and markers for their classrooms. We're fucking buying tactical outfits for fucking cops like that. Like, even if they were benevolent, it would still be, you would still want to get rid of them. But they're fucking not. It makes no sense.
Right.
The book talks about a study that was done in 2015 that shows that schools with SROs had nearly 5 times the arrest rate of non-SRO schools, even after controlling for student demographics like race and income. Like, dear Jesse Ryan.
Of course they do.
I'm just going to send this study over.
So the funny thing is, Jesse and I didn't really know each other before we served on the Measure U committee, but like the last vote happened like a few weeks before we were appointed, and she's my representative because I live in her district. So I sent her this email that was just like, I can't believe you would do this. Like, you're supposed to be representing our kids. This is, inherently putting, especially, our kids who have disabilities, as well as, Black and brown kids at risk. Like, why would you vote in this way? Like, you live in Hope Park, you claim that you care about all these things, and then like 2 weeks later, it's like, hi, I'm the chair of your committee. So
I love it.
So we've been able to have a collegial working relationship, but that was sort of like our initial like introduction to one another, was me like reaming her out about this really regrettable vote last year. So
I love it.
Me too.
I love to think about it.
Well, can somebody talk about the solutions? Like, we don't need cops. What do we need?
For one, I mean, I have to do like a sort of somewhat personal plug because my organization, Public Health Advocates, actually does work like this in Stockton Unified School District. And part of what they've actually been working on with their Faces of Resilience is how do we actually have like mental health and trauma support on campus so that students have a place where they feel safe, have a place where their emotional and their social and emotional needs are met. And I think it speaks to a lot of what people are pushing for right now, which is not necessarily having, licensed therapists on, available everywhere, although that certainly is helpful, but actually thinking about what people need to be able to buffer and to be able to feel like they're part of a community. And so sometimes that looks like being able to kind of restructure how you're operating within a school so that there are spaces and places and ways of being in classrooms that are designed to be able to include everyone and to be able to create the culture that we need. And I think we don't often think about how we start the school year and all of the things that happen over time that are these microaggressions that children are experiencing. The first day of school, they show up and a teacher who often doesn't look like them says, mispronounces their name and says, well, do you have a nickname, right? And it just like, it spirals from there. The lack of respect, the lack of sort of understanding of what may be happening, publicly calling students out in school and making them feel like, their performance is subject to ridicule from their peers, like just not recognizing some of the things that are happening in classrooms. And so it's really important that we place a premium on, investing in some of the things that don't cost that much money, but maybe take time or require dedicated space that are much more community grounded and can make a world of difference. So shout out to my Stockton team. I love you guys.
And the book talks about, like, pulls that idea out and talks about the need to invest in non-punitive disciplinary measures.
Yep.
So that we, like, students are not going to operate well when the criminal justice system is what the school chooses to support over the student, right?
Yep.
So, like, being able to provide spaces where emotional and physical safety are like an obvious part of the package of going to school, so that students can then focus on their learning spaces rather than whether or not they are fearful or stressed as a result of the presence of police. And the book goes further into talking about the creation of community schools, which provide a range of wraparound services.
Yep.
So, and like Flo's talking about, right? Like medical, mental health care, personal counseling, tutoring, community service, social justice programming, adult education, counseling for parents, like really serving the entire community rather than being a space where a kid shows up just to get in more trouble and potentially get pinched on a felony for
where everything is punitive.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, it kind of mirrors, right? And tell me if I'm wrong, but this is like the basic argument again, like in defunding the police in general, not just in schools.
Yeah, totally.
It's like, take that budget. Like, let's be, there are so many like reasons why people wind up in trouble or wind up, like doing shitty things or whatever, that we can diagnose, we can see coming early and figure out, like people need help with stuff, and we can just get them that help and skip the whole fucking thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And like
Absolutely.
for people like Flo and folks who've been in this game for a long time, it's like clearer to them than I think it is for a lot of the general public. I remember I was doing a story with a public defender, and I asked him a question about this case that we're working on. And I said, doesn't it feel like we're treating this symptom and not the illness? And he laughed in my fucking face. And he's like, yeah, that's what this is all about.
It's what we do.
Right. This is what we do every day. Like, of course.
Right.
It reminds me that, you know, how we see the world is sometimes shaped by whose vantage point we take on, right? And so a lot of times we've taken on the vantage point of like fear mongering, right? Like, and a lot of our life is structured in that way, right? We have car insurance in the off chance that we get into a car accident. We have an alarm on the off chance that somebody breaks into our home, right? Like all of these things where we are conditioned to think about worst case scenarios, but we're not conditioned to think about all the ways that things could go well and what we could do to possibly prevent that. We're just trained to think, even in our own lives, about emergency response. And so it's not surprising that it's really hard for people when we start talking about what would it look like if we invested those dollars elsewhere. Like if I told you right now, cancel your car insurance, you'd laugh me out of the room. Like, but what if I get into a car accident? What will I do? Right. And not thinking about, well, what are all of the ways? And I'm not telling anybody to cancel their car insurance. I'm certainly not planning on canceling mine.
I'm sold. I'm canceling. I'm on the phone like, with my insurance agent.
What are all the ways that we could potentially prevent getting into a car accident? And should we invest, if we only have $100 a month, should we invest all of it in that? Or should we think about investing some more in what we could do to prevent? And I think that's just, it's like a mind frame shift. And it's amazing to me that the more interaction, the more indoctrination you've had into a law enforcement mindset, the more all you do is catastrophize your life. Like I've never met people who are scared of more things than law enforcement. They will always give you a worst case scenario, but not recognizing that the majority of their calls are not worst case scenarios, but they're always prepared for that option. And so it becomes a worldview. It doesn't just become a practical reality.
Well, it's also like a bulletproof legal defense. Like cops can do literally anything they fucking want to, as long as they say that they were afraid for their lives.
Right.
So as long as they can like create a scenario in which they were afraid for their lives, they can steal from you, they can beat you, they can assault you, they can kill you on camera. And if they feared for their lives, they will probably walk for that. And that is how that works. Yeah. So it's not hard to, you know, like these guys are like always trying to cook up situations about why they would be afraid for their lives.
Oh, they're not. Yeah. They're not scared many of those times. It's like, that's my defense. I was scared.
But they have to get there, right? They have to do the mental
gymnastics. Reach for their band or whatever.
I actually do think in some instances they're scared. Sure. I think they've been conditioned, like, you know, I don't know if I've talked about it on the show before, but like their training, like the first couple of days is just like watching videos of officers who died in the line of duty. Like that is traumatizing and terrifying, right? And what would it look like if you showed videos of officers de-escalating situations and, you know, engaging in helpful ways, right? As the start of your training for rookie, you know, officers.
Right. I mean, it's like the SRO thing I read out. It's like, it's telling them that your students are the enemy.
Right.
That's how you have to view this. That's the lens that you view this universe now.
Right.
It's like if we just I'm not pro cop, but if on that first day of training,
seemed like you love cops a little bit.
I don't know, Shannon.
I feel like this is like the second or third time I've been called out for maybe loving cops. Dear cops.
The key on the show is to nobody say that they don't like cops, because everyone else would be like, I don't know.
It sounds like you kind of love them.
I think I see some boot remnants under your lip right here.
If there was like, if we put just any amount of effort into social emotional learning for the fucking police department and in education systems, in schools, right? Like just like having the space to like have some self-awareness, to like figure out like social cues, how to like engage with each other, how to like sit down and have a conversation instead of immediately reach for your fucking pepper spray. Like, I feel like maybe we could get somewhere. But also we should defund the police, and we should just abolish them, and they shouldn't be in schools.
And also, what would it look like if we invested in the school-based health centers? I mean, I have to definitely give a shout out to them, because as we're talking about, bringing in the entire community and the school being a community resource, that's one way, right? When you're providing healthcare, not only to the students who are attending the school, but to the broader community, you also have an ability to be able to address issues that, your teachers within the school can't address by themselves, right? You can provide mental health care to an entire family. You can provide trauma support to an entire family that may be going through something. You're able to get to some of those root causes, and you can have healthier students. How often have we had a behavioral issue? I think about even our prisons, right? Everybody in there, may be an offender in some way, but they often are all, I should say often, they are almost all also people who have been victims of crime in the past, people who have been, who have experienced major traumas in their life, like people who have been failed by the education system in many instances. I mean, the number of folks who are in our prisons who didn't read it at grade level, who didn't graduate from high school. I mean, like, this is a prime example of how one institution gears people up to be a part of another institution by simply failing them from the outset. And I think that's not spoken about enough. I think, even if we talk about how kids get to school every day, and just the times where we were trying to basically like charge kids for truancy instead of realizing that we don't have a functional transportation system, and some of these kids are doing the best they can, and their day starts out being lambasted for being late instead of being thanked for showing up at all. Like, it's infuriating. It's I got here in the middle of first period, but fuck it, I'm here. Like, welcome me in and let's get the rest of the day going instead of harassing me about why I'm late.
Yeah. There was one kid in that story from 1995 at Encina where they'd left, they did everything the cops told them to, but after the fact, everything was over, they had to grab their books from the lunchroom because they'd left them there. They had to grab their books to go to work because you're a low-income kid at high school. And so they went to go get their books, and the cops immediately beat them and arrested them.
What's another incident about the little kiddie beatdown from Encina High of 95? Featured in this video is one of the friends of the show at the time, just a little piglet. He was a little oinklet. He's a little oinklet. He's
now sheriff.
Children.
Yeah.
This is of course, I'm speaking of Sheriff Scott
25 years ago.
25 years ago.
And he has grown into the king pig of the shit pile. So fucking kudos to you, man. It looks like you've really been working hard for at least 25 years protecting and fucking serving.
Yeah, well, he was the PIO on this news clip, and everything he says, you're watching it and you're like, this is all a fucking lie. Like, in 1995, there wasn't much footage of cops beating people, but there was footage of this one, and it was cops attacking children.
Yeah.
In a school.
Right. Even with the grainy footage, we could see that.
Even with that, we could see that. And Scott Jones just being like, well, they were protecting themselves. There were kids attacking them. No, there weren't. There's no footage of that, Scott.
Also, if you fucking roll up on a 16-year-old, spray mace in his eyes so he can't see, and then grab him by the shoulders, and he punches you in the face, that's your fault.
I also watched one of the officers pummel a student who was on the ground repeatedly, just like going at this kid. And I'm just like,
kick a kid's legs out from under him.
Or
who's
lay him down the ground,
face down as you do that. Yeah.
Who's handcuffed. Who can't break his own fall.
So Scott Jones just going on TV and lying out of his little porcine teeth. Like it just blows, like it doesn't blow my mind because we've seen 25 years of this shit from him, but it's just like, it just really drives home. Like, now I really think people know how much they lie. And now going back at this footage, I really think that it can be a really interesting sort of case study on here's how local media used to cover cops. It's not much better today, but here's how it used to cover cops. Here's how, you know, it sort of made primacy of what the Scott Joneses of the world had to say. And here's how it downplayed what these kids had to say. And it's fascinating. And again, this is 1995. This is in the middle of the tough on crime 1990s, where Clinton and the rest, and you know, Al, thank you for inventing the internet, but you were a part of this shit too. We're really driving home their ideas that these boys of color were these like super predators. And as they're saying that on national TV, that made it culturally okay for our cops to beat these, you know, black and brown kids with impunity here locally.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Dave, speaking of unconscionable tragedies and disasters, I've been laid off. Now this is a double-edged tragedy, because one is the layoff. The second part is that I've run out of voices content and I need more. And so I'm here on bended knee. Please guide me and tell me where I can find more of this great voices content to get me through this extremely trying time.
Wow. You know, I appreciate that, Sky, you considered this a safe space where you can share this kind of thing with us.
I do, and I appreciate and love all of you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, it means a lot. We love you too. And I will say that there is a space for you to find more voices content. It's called voicesrivercity.com. Shannon,
you know, I should have fucking tried that before I asked this question. I guess.
Go Bing it next time. You know, we've got 3 years of content there, and it goes all over the place. News, arts coverage. There's some really weird Q&As in there too. Of course, most recently it's been the podcast. I'm working on the District 3 fucking like Follow the Money project. But Rich Desmond, the lifelong cop who's running against Greg Fishman, Rich has so much money coming from cops and developers almost only. But like I'm up to today 200 people that I've put down on the spreadsheet. I'm maybe a third of the way through it. So wake up Sac County. Like, this guy has the entire business world and Republican Party behind him. So it's like, B of all, it's going to take me a couple days to finish this shit. But I think, you know, when we talk about, I guess I just want to go on a little tangent. I want us to not forget that there are politicians out there right now. We know that we're driving home the idea of like cops shouldn't exist right now on this show, but let's also remember the politicians, the current ones we have that are fighting for that to be a reality. Katie Valenzuela and my Vang actually signed up and signed a pledge to say that they will not accept any cop money. So pay attention to the politicians who do that. I think that's really important. There were 2 others. I don't remember who they were. Does anyone else by any chance?
And other people are signing on to the pledge now.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it in a couple days, but
yeah, they're the other one was Tamika Lecluse, and
Tamika signed up, yeah,
and I'm trying to remember who the fourth, because there were 4 women who originally signed on, and then I saw over the weekend that Pastor Les signed on as well.
Good.
Is
he giving back Cooper's money then?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You know, the question does come in around that, right? Like, does accepting funds from former law enforcement, especially someone as
who is now an elected, right?
Right. Especially someone as awful as Jim Cooper. Like, I know personally am in relationship with two people who will not occupy the same breathing space as Jim Cooper because of the abuses that he rained down on them. I've heard him referred to as the black cop from Boys in the Hood on more than one occasion.
Oof.
So Jim Cooper is not a friend of the show. I wouldn't even joke about that. Fuck Jim Cooper. And he has a lot of regressive and it's hurtful to have the same type of abuse rained down on you by someone who shares pigment with you. It makes it even worse. So I think that's a real question that remains to be seen, because technically he's not law enforcement. And so I'm curious how this plays out when you could have former law enforcement or people who've moved on and are doing other things, or retired law enforcement still contributing to campaigns. I think, it's obviously headed in the right direction, but there are still some remaining questions about, does this indicate where your allegiances lie in terms of these issues?
Sure.
And that's not to question Pastor
I would recommend,
but that's just in general, what does it mean?
Yeah. I'd recommend, if Jim Cooper is a small part of your campaign, maybe give it back.
Yeah.
And also, if you're running against a hyper progressive, maybe give back Steve Hanson's money if he gave you some too, and if you were in an ALF class with him. Just saying. So
not wrong.
We've got some, we are in other places, Voices River City, other than just our site. We are on Twitter at Voices River City, Facebook Voices River City, Instagram at Voices River City, and that's always very funny. We're on YouTube, and I try to talk about that every episode, and I always forget it. But you get to see our pretty little faces, and I think it's a really fun dynamic, especially during this time where we don't get to be around people. I've had a couple friends say that they enjoy watching us, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, if you aren't tired of Zoom calls, you can watch ours.
Yeah. You'll love it.
It's super fun.
And then what else? Oh, we're on Patreon, patreon.com/Voices River City. People have been very responsive to that this month, and that's been really cool awesome. And meaningful. You can go as low as $5 a month. That's a beer at the bar that you're not going to if you're being safe during the time of COVID. You can go up to $25 a month, which will land you a t-shirt and coffee mug in the mail. And Flo just convinced us to get some different colored t-shirts. So we're going to have many colored t-shirts for Voices River City. We've got the mug that Flo's drinking out of right there. We might have some other interesting weird stuff coming out. Obviously the California stickers and weird stuff like that. We're gonna go heavy on the Voices store, but if you get the $25 a month, you get a t-shirt and mug for free.
We also have extra special packages for our Squillion tier donors.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
Yeah.
You want that Squillion.
Yeah, you get all of our tits.
We're gonna free our nipples.
Oh my god. Just some weird millionaire is gonna get that now, and we'll be like,
right.
Oh, we fucking promised.
And sadly, Jareen wouldn't even back me up. He'd be like, you said you I'm waiting to see what's gonna happen.
You're like, dude, Kempa said it, but did you say no?
Right.
Just to be sure, we should print out some Voices pasties that we
there you
can
go.
That we can be wearing.
There we go.
Ooh, that's a good merch idea.
Some Voices tassels.
Some Voices tassels.
Oh my gosh, no.
Yes.
No.
Anyway, I'm on Twitter at Kempa, YOUKNOWKEMPA.
I'm at Guillotine for You. That's Guillotine, the number 4, YOU.
I'm at Shan N.D. Stevens.
And I am at Flojaune, FLOJAUNE.
And I swear to God, we'll get to chapter 2, but there was just a lot to cover, and people were very passionate about chapter 3 tonight. So I'm glad we did what we did.
Yeah, and again, get the book. It's a free download on Verso, and we're covering some of it, but we are covering a tip of a very large iceberg that this guy goes over in this, and I don't know. It's a hell of a read, in my
It goes
opinion.
deep with references, and you can dive down those holes. It's like it's a fantastic read.
Yeah,
it's really
highly
good.
recommend it. So if you're not already reading it, get on it for sure.
Yeah.
Don't go to the bar. Read the fucking book at home.
Yeah,
with beer.
don't go to the bar. Read books and listen to podcasts, guys.
Of course.
Joy.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to give this a shot. We did it last time, so I'm going to go ahead and just give it to you guys. We love you. Everybody stay safe.
Stay healthy.
No.
Stay sane.
Stay sane.
All right.
Sorry.
Stay healthy. Or stay sane. Or stay both.
Now we're all off. Now
I'm sorry. It was
Stay
my
away
fault
from me.
this time.
Well, you've
I'm
ruined
ecstatic
another
that it's your
podcast
fault.
you've ruined,
That
Shannon.
it's not, for once, it's not me to ruin the entire episode.
Well,
The
I guess you can
entire
still
episode?
publish
The
this.
entire
The
episode.
whole thing
That's how
is
I read
ruined.
it. I didn't sleep for weeks.
I totally forgot that I was stay sane. I'm gonna remember that I'm stay sane next week. I'm gonna write it on a
You were
post-it.
so enthusiastic too.
Yeah,
He's like, stay healthy.
Stay healthy though.
Not your line.
Oops.
All right.
Sorry about that.
I'm calling it.
The letter
This
four.
show is
Letter
over.
four. I'm just
The
waiting
letter
for
four.
it. The letter
The
four.
I will
It's
never
done.
do it. It will never happen.
It's gonna happen. I'm sure it's gonna happen.
Has a post-it note that's right next to his computer that's like the number 4.
In all caps.
I'm gonna do that with stay sane.
And everybody comes to his house and is just like,
The hell's that?
Brad, do you have 4 issues? Like, what's happening?
I'm like, dude, it's COVID. Why are
I
you in
will
my
not
house?
be defeated.
It's the Sesame Street episode I'm on. Don't worry about it.
What an outro.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye.